Not quite placed properly. So, Jenny, do you mind if I bring you Jen through this conversation? We do know each other, so I don't want to go Dr. Wong.
I prefer Jenny.
Okay, great.
At the most, Dr. Jenny.
Okay. So Jenny, I was wondering whether we could start off, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of, why did you pick EAP? What was your experience like as part of the EAP program?
Okay, so I was very fortunate to even learn about EAP at the time. I started the program in 1986. So this was when dinosaurs roamed the earth, a long time ago. At the time, this was actually before Dr. Maddox was director of the program. The Early Entrance program was a small experimental program being run out of the psychology department. And the internet wasn't really a thing. And it was really lucky, maybe fated, that somehow we found out about it. I think literally we just happened to be at McDonald's one day and someone had left a copy of the Los Angeles Times with an article on EAP on the table that we sat down at. And my mom saw it and, said, I think I should take you to go get tested. And of course, all of her friends thought she was crazy because I was probably 10 years old at the time. And so she came, she brought me, much like a lot of you in this room, she disregarded the opinion of her friends, for which I am eternally grateful. And so she brought me to get tested the first time, I believe, when I was around 10 years old. And I did not pass the test the first time, but it was very close. So Dr. Dan Slater spoke to my mom and said, please bring her back next year. She's quite young and her score was quite close. And so I came back the next year, passed. And back then, what they did was they had you just start part-time. And so I took a couple classes over the summer when I was 11. And then I took one class, each quarter. And I was coming from high school. I was coming from Mark Keppel High School in Monterey Park. And I think I was taking the bus up Hellman to get here. It was supposed to be a full year, but after 3 quarters, I'd had, maybe 4 or 5 classes, and I had a 4.0 grade point average. I was really miserable in high school. And so I was allowed to matriculate full-time. And so then I graduated 4 years later in 1991 with my bachelor's degree in communication. And then I went on to get 2 more degrees in communication. I got my master's and my Ph.D. from USC's Annenberg School for Communications. I'm a social scientist by training.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your parents' level of involvement was? I mean, you mentioned that you saw that article that sort of led you to apply into the EAP program. After that point, I guess, what was the level of involvement of your parents in your overall academic experience?
So I'm a first-generation Chinese immigrant, and my parents' level of involvement was very low. They themselves did not have the greatest English. And even before I started at Cal State LA, there would be times when, maybe a letter would come from a utility company, and it was on me as the firstborn, the oldest child, to read that and make sure that they understood what that letter from the gas company was saying to them. So their level of involvement in my college education was really minimal. They were there obviously to support me and feed me and pick me up because I couldn't drive, and, but when it came to picking classes or figuring out a major, I had to do that for myself, and I didn't do it right at first. That very, very first summer, I was like 11 years old, and I think like LA Law, I had watched a lot of episodes. This was the 80s, and I was like, I think I want to be a lawyer. And so I looked through the course catalog, and I thought, okay, I'm going to sign up for this 101 class in criminal justice. That's logical. I still think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, I get there, I'm like, oh, this is classes for cops. Okay. That's not. I finished. I got an A. I was like, oh, okay, note to self, criminal justice. That's not what lawyers major was. English, philosophy, and poli science. But how would I know that, right? As a first generation. So I figured that out. And so, don't be afraid of trial and error. Don't be afraid of letting your kids, pick crazy classes that they want to take, you know, let them go and find out. There is value in just building that sense of self-efficacy, right? I had to steer my own ship, and it's made me, you know, I think more, you know, more confident that I can get myself from point A to point B, partly because I had to. That's certainly one of the gifts you get as a first-generation immigrant.
Thank you. And could you tell us a little more about what you ended up doing? So after you earned your Ph.D., where did you go from there?
So I wrote my dissertation on organizational commitment, and that led me to about a decade-long career in management consulting. So I wrote a quantitative dissertation using survey methodology, and it was my doctorate is in organizational communication. So I was very interested in what was happening inside of like Fortune 500 companies. And so in the course of gathering the data for my dissertation, I wound up with a job offer. So Rockwell HQ, which used to be in Southern California, turned me down for the data request. They were like, no, you're not giving out your survey here. However, did you want a job? They were administering a global employee satisfaction survey. They call it employee engagement these days, but back then it was called ESAT, and they had, you know, it was like going out to something like 36,000 employees, 12 languages, 40 countries, and they had a survey vendor that was going to do the administration, the collection, the scanning, the data crunching, but they really wanted someone that was internal to Rockwell who understood and could ask the vendor questions like, why are you running a hierarchical multiple regression? Why not a simultaneous multiple regression? Which they didn't have anybody in the HR department that could, you know, that had that exact skill set around quantitative analysis of survey data. They didn't have social scientists. And so that put me inside of this specialty area within human resources called organization development. So I was an OD consultant then for the next 11 years. I moved on from the position at Rockwell to a couple of external facing positions with Mercer and then PricewaterhouseCoopers. And then I was in-house in a couple of, you know, I'm an LA girl, so, you know, Countrywide, AIG, that's where I spent the first decade of my post-academic career.
And at some point though, you did create you co-founded a startup business, right?
Yeah. So after 11 years of being an OD practitioner and OD consultant, both internal and externally, my career kind of took a left, and it had a lot to do with my personal life because I met and married my husband, who is a full stack web developer. And so he had hung out his own shingle. We're both former PricewaterhouseCoopers consultants, which is how we met. And so he had hung out his own shingle, web development shop called Limelight Web Development. And when I separated from AIG, you know, it was right at that moment where several things happened. You know, one was that he had gotten his little business that was just him at the time, right to the point where he could really use the help of a non-developer, someone to do, and I'd always helped him with redoing proposals, but you know, he could use someone to help him with administration and marketing and sales and all that stuff. And also we found out that we were pregnant with our first child. And so
that changes everything.
It does. And so I said to him, you know, I could go out and look for a job while I'm like 6 months out of here, or we could take this as an opportunity to see how we work together, right? Because not every husband and wife should work together. But I knew he liked the way I did his business proposals, you know, and I knew that he really needed marketing help because he was a web developer who didn't have his own website. Literally hiding from business. Like you're such a good developer that people have to literally track you down to get you to give you money. Like, let's change that, right? And so while I was pregnant is when I started working with him. We decided that we liked working together. So after the baby came, it was great to have flexibility. And we were able to grow that services business. You know, we doubled, tripled revenues over the next few years together. I was instrumental in hiring on a couple extra developers and, you know, just helping grow the business overall. And then we caught the startup bug, right? So at that point we were a services business, which is sort of like, you work an hour, you bill an hour, you work an hour, you bill an hour. And we started talking back in 2012 about could we create a product more in the Silicon Valley style of startup? Because we had my social science background, which gave me a really unique perspective on things like behavioral science and decision science. And he had, deep expertise. He'd been building e-commerce sites since e-commerce was invented, basically. So nobody knew more about how to make an e-commerce site than he did. And so I thought, well, I have perspective on online shopping behavior and how to get online shoppers to do what you want them to do, and then you can actually build it. So let's put these two things together. And so we launched a second business together while continuing to be owner-operators of our first business. And so that startup is called Shopping Quizzes. And so I worked on that full time as founder, non-technical co-founder and CEO, basically the business lead and product lead for about 4 years. And then just recently we decided it was time for me to go back to management consulting. But Shopping Quizzes is still going, and we still we still are working on our ideas as a husband and wife team. But I'm also very happy to be sort of back as a consultant, which is kind of my natural habitat and very much part of my calling.
So what's the premise of the Shopping Quizzes sort of business, and what's the core idea behind the business itself?
So we started off always working on the problem that online shopping takes too long because of overwhelming choices. And so for 4 years, I was trying to synthesize all of the research that I was aware of around a whole bunch of different topics. It was very cross-disciplinary, right? So there's, research from education about just-in-time, learning and adult learning. There was paradox of choice stuff coming out of decision science, processing fluency, visual dominance. Like there were a lot of different ways that research and evidence could be applied to make online shopping easier. But a lot of the people who are making online shopping tools, their expertise is in relational databases, their expertise is in retail, their expertise is not in human cognition, right? So I felt like we had a unique perspective. So Shopping Quizzes is a technique where we make these custom widgets where let's say we have a customer, let's say we get a cruise line as a customer, right? We actually have been recently talking to one of the major cruise lines. So they sell 300 different cruises, and that's before you get to picking dates and cabins and excursions. I mean, just like in general, there's 300 plus routes, right? So you're very unlikely to actually book a cruise on their website, right? And instead, you're more likely to go talk to a travel agent. Still, to this day, people talk like analog phones, right, to travel agents to book their cruises. Because the human being helps you whittle down through conversation all of your options. And so then the cruise company has to give up significant margin to the travel agent, right, on the booking. So they would prefer you book more to the site. So then, since I have 3 degrees in communication, we try to make their website work more like human conversation. So if you land at the website, it'll say something to you, it'll ask you these very sort of cognitively friendly questions, like a long cruise or a short cruise, a budget cruise or a luxury cruise, a warm weather cruise or cold weather cruise, right? And then just by doing that to get you to a personal top 3. Because providing 3 options is actually a magic number for conversion, right? People feel like more options is better. That's a very common perception. But if you're trying to actually close a deal, right, get a final commitment and purchase, which is known as conversion, more choices is not better, right? And maybe a lot of you are aware of like the research on 401k plans, where like the more options offered in a 401k plan, the less likely the employees are to contribute anything at all. Whereas if they're just like a default setting, right? So it's sort of using that, it's applying, so it's like I said, very cross-disciplinary, right? Research out of marketing, psychology, education, communication, and putting it all together into a tool that helps you shop.
Wow, that's So I'm kind of wondering, going back in the past now, touching again upon your experience as an EAP student while you're still here.
Yes.
First of all,
for a lot of shoulder pads.
So besides the fashion choices, I was kind of wondering whether was there a particular moment where you knew that you wanted to go into communications and specifically moving towards organizational communication? How did you go from the crim, testing it out and noticing that wasn't what you wanted to do to where you are now, like that path?
Well, I found a mentor. The short answer is I found a mentor, and he is to this day one of the most honored instructors, here, not only in the communication department, but at CSULA as a whole. That's Dr. Kevin Baskey. He's an amazing professor. If your kids can take class with him, I highly recommend it. He was, very important figure in my life. And so, back in 1987 or whenever it was, I was just like a freshman or sophomore that I had to take the Speech 150 GE requirement, right? But I happened to wind up in his section. And he was director of the forensics team, and I got involved in speech and debate. And it was very easy at that point. I became very involved in speech and debate. And I was actually, I will say, I believe I was the very first EAP debater. And now when you walk into the speech and debate team, it's like all EAP. But I think I was the first. And so that gave me sort of an easy path to declaring speech comm as a major. And then from there, I applied. I had kind of changed my focus at that point, and so I actually wound up applying to several different graduate programs in journalism, thinking that maybe I wanted to become a broadcaster. What can I say? It's like growing up, the only Asian woman on television was Connie. And I had the gift of gab, and so that seemed like something that would be interesting to explore. So I actually was accepted to journalism programs all over, including the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, the master's degree journalism program at Berkeley and Stanford. But I decided to stay close to home and wound up going to the doctoral program in communication instead, kind of following in the footsteps of my mentor, and taught my own sections of speech comm. For a few years there while I was a graduate student.
I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, so not only was I sort of like a freak undergrad, but then I was also teaching my standalone sections of undergraduate communications classes when I was like 17 years old.
So a question now, kind of thinking about both your experiences in the past and then what you know of the E program now. Could you share with us kind of your take on the E program as it is currently? And are there major differences that you can see? It could be positive or negative, but between your experience when you were a student versus.
Yeah, well, the size, right? That's a huge and very important difference. When I was going through the program, there were just a handful of us. There's only one other EAPster that I've managed to keep in touch with all these years, and unfortunately I don't see her very much because she lives in Orange County and I live in the Valley. But at least we're still, in touch and friends on Facebook and things like that. But having a cohort, I just feel like you guys are I'm so happy to see the growth of the program. When I got back in touch with the program a few years ago, and I was told that there was over 100 students in the program, I was blown away and overjoyed and felt so proud and just so glad that this program was here as a resource for all those kids who need it, right? Because, for me, the program was so important. And such a lifesaver, right? Because it wasn't just that I was smart and could do the work, it was also that I really hated high school, right? And was really miserable there, right? That's like the extra sort of qualifier, right? It's just not like, can you do the work, right? A lot of kids that are currently in high school today potentially could do the work, right? But you also have to kind of hate high school. And then you're like, right? Because then your opportunity cost is really minimized, right? Because if you were miserable there, then your odds of finding something here that will fit you, and there's just everything's here, right? It's amazing, the diversity, the options. If you can't find a tribe or a club or an activity or someone to go to Ren Fair with, you are just not trying.
So if you were to speak to a group of each students, let's say in the group right
Like
now.
I did last year.
Yeah, like you did last year.
Okay.
What advice would you share with those students? If you had a chance to talk to them again, like you did last year.
I think one of the messages that I had for them last year was that they of all people need to rapidly understand, right? They're fast learners to begin with, right? So if there's one thing that I want them to learn quickly, faster than the average bear, is that comparisons to others are not useful. Right? They're already, they were probably already like the smartest kid in first grade, and then, they come here and then they're surrounded by other kids that are like highly, severely gifted, and the urge to compare themselves against this new cohort will be there. And then they'll go on to Cambridge and Harvard or, wherever like they wind up. And then there's going to be always the urge to compare themselves to others, right? But the faster that they can learn that that's not useful, right? The more that they can give their gifts to the world, right? And that what they should be paying attention to instead is what is the work that they intrinsically enjoy, right? Like being super smart, you get a little bit hooked on external validation, right? The external rewards. I mean, you're getting them medals, Trin. Right? I didn't get medals. Okay, that's fine. I got winner. It's Jennie with an IE. If you make one for me. Okay. So, yeah. All right. Thank you. And so you're a high performer, right? Like you're definitionally you're a high performer in an important way that the world values by the time you get here. So those extrinsic rewards, they're a hook, they're addictive, they're a little dangerous, right? And so what you don't want to do is get into this thing where you're chasing pats on the back, where you're chasing believe me, I want my kids to get scholarships, like I want to retire someday. I want them to get full rides, But in terms of like the ego, like there's the economics and practicality of it. I'm an immigrant. I have healthy respect for scholarship dollars, right? But in terms of like your ego, your identity, like where your feeling of worth and self-esteem comes from, right? Is to not go chasing like the awards and the rankings and the comparisons, right? And instead to be thinking about what intrinsically lights you up. What puts you into a flow state? What are those things you do where time goes away? That's the gift you're here to give the world, And not everyone is here to become an astronaut, and not everyone's here to cure cancer. Maybe you're here to write the next great sci-fi novel. Maybe you're here to, become a kick-ass higher ed administrator. Whatever it is, right? The more that you pay attention to that. And the thing is a lot of people don't learn this lesson until much, much later in life. So I would say to the EAP students, like if you're fast learners, prove it. Prove it and learn this lesson that people figure out in their 50s, learn it when you're 15, right? That's going to give you a long and satisfying career.
Excellent advice. We're going to take that. We're going to pull that clip from the video. We're going to. This is also familiar to you. Speaking to the choir here. So I have one last question, then we'll open it to Q&A. I was wondering whether now putting on sort of a parent hat.
Yes, I have a 5-year-old, I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I told Dr. Maddox I have a secret ambition to send you the first, second generation Easter. No pressure.
We would love it, but yes, so what do you think?
I mostly just don't want to have to pay for a UC.
And they think it's free scholarship. Yes, so what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts on what should be sort of a parent's role for a student within the program?
This really is informed by my work experience, right? So I am a parent, but they're young, right? And so I think, the point of view that I'm bringing to this is as a management consultant, because I have been doing leadership development and I've acted as an executive coach for a very, very long time. I've had my coaching certificate for over 10 years, and I think when you look at the model for parental involvement with any student, right? But I think obviously, we're in the context of highly gifted students, profoundly talented young people, is that you could take one of two hats, right? You could take on the manager hat, where you sort of decide what needs to happen and then break it down and delegate the pieces to your kid to execute, right? That's one model. That's the manager model, traditional managerial model. And I can understand why some people choose that model. But what I would encourage you to learn is the coaching model instead, right? Which is where you take a step back and you say, just like a football coach, right? It's like when you're a football coach, you don't get to touch the ball, right? Your kid is the athlete on the field. Your kid is the one that has to, throw it, catch it, and make the tackle, right? And so as a coach, your job is to give them feedback and ask them powerful questions and help them arrive at their own insights, right? As an executive coach, I work exclusively with high performers. And so my clients always know more than me about what's going on in their job. And what I charge by the hour, it would take too long for them to tell me all the details of that, right? I also don't need the details, right? They know the specifics of what happened in that class or what happened in that meeting or, the politics of those specific players, right? I don't need to know. What I need to know is what is the dilemma that they're dealing with, and then how can I hold a space and reframe things so that they can figure it out for themselves and have their own insights. And the thing is that you maybe have noticed this, that when you delegate tasks to your high performers, that they don't always get done. But when they have their own insights and they're acting on their own ideas, right? When they have their own realizations about what will benefit them, those get done, right? You don't have to nag for those things to get done. And so, yes, I think those are the two models of parental involvement.
It's interesting because you have both your personal experience being a graduate and the other layers of professional experience that you have that can really inform what the students are probably going through, really.
Yes.
Right? And sort of that connection between the parent's role and the children's experience as well.
Yes.
So I really do appreciate you sharing all of those insights.
My
That's
pleasure.
fantastic. So I'd like to open actually up the floor to any questions that anybody in the room may have for Jennie, since she's here with us today. Does anyone have any questions that